It was the morning of December 6th, 1917. The citizens of Halifax stood at their windows, watching a ship burn in the harbor. Most of them did not know they had less than 20 minutes to live. The ship was called Mont Blanc. She was carrying nearly 3,000 tons of high explosives, and she was not supposed to be there at all. This is the Halifax explosion. At 9 hours, 4 minutes, and 35 seconds in the morning, a French munitions ship detonated alongside Pier 6 with a force of roughly 2.9 kilotons of TNT, killing at least 1,782 people and injuring 9,000 more. Over the next 20 minutes of narration, we're going to look at 3 questions. Why was a ship carrying nearly 3,000 tons of high explosives allowed into a crowded harbor at all? Why, in the 20 minutes between the collision and the blast, no warning ever reached the city? And who, in the end, was held responsible? Because the answer to that last question tells us almost everything about how wartime accountability actually worked. Before the war, Mont Blanc would not have been allowed past the harbor mouth. Halifax had grown up around its waterfront. The Intercolonial Railway and its deep water terminal were finished in 1880. The British garrison left in late 1905 and early 1906, and the dockyard passed to the Canadian government. The Royal Canadian Navy was founded there in 1910. By the early years of the 20th century, Halifax was a working port with peacetime rules, and one of those rules was simple. Ships carrying dangerous cargo were not permitted into the inner harbor. Then the war came. After August 1914, German U-boats began sinking Allied shipping in the North Atlantic at a rate the Royal Navy had not planned for. The Allies responded with a convoy system. Merchant ships gathered at Bedford Basin, the broad, sheltered water at the northwestern end of Halifax Harbor, protected by 2 sets of anti-submarine nets and patrolled by Royal Canadian Navy ships. From there, under the cover of British cruisers and destroyers, they crossed to Britain and France in groups too large for a single submarine to threaten. The system worked. It also rewrote the harbor. By 1917, the population of Halifax and Dartmouth together stood between 60,000 and 65,000 people. The weight of goods passing through the harbor had risen nearly 9-fold over pre-war levels. In 1915, management of the entire harbor fell under Royal Canadian Navy control. All neutral ships bound for North American ports were now required to report to Halifax for inspection. And the old peacetime ban on dangerous cargo, the rule that would have kept Mont Blanc out, was quietly relaxed. The reasoning was rational at the imperial scale. Munitions had to reach France somehow. The U-boats made the southern routes too expensive. Halifax, with its inspection station, its anti-submarine nets, and its convoy assembly point at Bedford Basin, was the obvious choke point. Routing ammunition ships through it was the safest option for the Atlantic crossing as a whole. What was not safe was the city of Halifax. The convoy system had been designed against submarines, not against itself. There was no separate berth for explosive cargo, no holding anchorage outside the inner harbor, no ritual of guard ships or warning signals when a powder ship came in. By the autumn of 1917, an ammunition vessel queued for the nets like any other freighter and pushed up the Narrows alongside the ferries crossing between Halifax and Dartmouth. The wartime relaxation was complete, and almost nobody on shore knew about it. By 1917, the rules had been thinned out for a war. What they had not been thinned out for was a single morning when 2 ships happened to leave port at the same time. The first ship was a Norwegian SS Immo. She had sailed from the Netherlands en route to New York to pick up Belgian relief supplies, humanitarian cargo for occupied Belgium, organized by the Commission for Relief in Belgium. Her captain was Håkan. She arrived in Halifax on December 3rd for neutral inspection and spent 2 days at anchor in Bedford Basin, waiting on coal. Clear to leave on the 5th, Immo's departure stalled. Her coal load arrived too late in the afternoon, and by the time the bunkers were full, the anti-submarine nets had been raised for the night. She would not move until morning. The second ship was the French SS Mont Blanc. She arrived from New York on the evening of December 5th under the command of Captain M. Lemedec. Her holds carried TNT and picric acid, both high explosives. Her decks carried barrels of benzol, a highly flammable fuel, and her cargo manifest also listed gun cotton. She was, in effect, a floating bomb under orders from the French government to cross the Atlantic to Bordeaux. She, too, was meant to join a convoy in Bedford Basin. She, too, arrived too late to enter before the nets came up. She anchored outside for the night. That evening, an experienced Halifax harbor pilot named Francis Mackey boarded her. Mackey understood what was in her holds. He asked the harbor authorities for what surviving testimony at the Wreck Commissioner's inquiry would later call special protections, at minimum, a guard ship given the cargo. The request was refused. None were provided. Mackey took her in anyway. At about 7:30 on the morning of December 6th, the anti-submarine net between George Island and Pier 21 was opened, and Mont Blanc was the second ship through. She moved up the Dartmouth side of the harbor, holding to the rule of starboard passage at the prescribed speed of 5 knots. At very nearly the same moment, on signals from the guard ship HMCS Acadia, Immo was cleared to leave Bedford Basin with pilot William Hayes aboard. She entered the Narrows above the harbor speed limit, trying to make up the time her late coal had cost her. The Narrows is a strait. 2 ships heading in opposite directions through it should pass port to port, left side to left side. They almost never did that morning. Immo had already been forced over towards the Dartmouth shore by passing American and Canadian traffic. Captain Horatio Brannan of the tugboat Stella Maris saw her coming and ordered his own ship over to the western side to stay clear. By the time Mackey first spotted Immo, she was about 4,000 feet away and on a line that pointed at Mont Blanc's starboard bow. What happened next happened in whistles. Mackey gave a single short blast. "I have the right of way." Immo answered with 2 short blasts. "I will not yield." Mackey ordered his engines stopped and angled slightly to starboard, hoping to slip past on the Dartmouth side, and signaled again. Immo answered again with 2 blasts. The ships were now closing at slow speed. Mackey could not run Mont Blanc aground. The shock to her cargo might detonate her where she sat. In a last-second decision, he ordered the helm hard to port, trying to cut across Immo's bow. At the same moment, Immo reversed her engines. The transverse thrust of her propeller swung her head back into Mont Blanc's starboard side. The collision was almost gentle. Immo's prow pushed into the number 1 hold at roughly 1 knot. The hull damage was minor. The deck damage was not. Benzol barrels stowed on Mont Blanc's deck toppled and split. Vapor flooded across the boards and down into the hold. As Immo's engines disengaged, the grinding of metal threw sparks. The vapor caught. A fire began at the waterline and traveled fast. Captain Lemedec understood what was loaded beneath that fire and gave the order to abandon ship. The crew of Mont Blanc went over the side into 2 lifeboats and rowed for the Dartmouth shore, shouting warnings about the cargo as they pulled. The warnings went nowhere. Engines and shouting drowned them out. Their drifting ship, on fire, beached herself against Pier 6 at the foot of Richmond Street. On shore, the city was already coming to the windows. A burning ship in the harbor was an event. Office workers, school children, dockmen, mothers with babies, they crowded behind glass to watch the column of black smoke and the flames climbing the rigging. Halifax Fire Department's West Street Station 2 sent the engine Patricia, the first motorized fire engine in Canada, racing to Pier 6. The crew were unrolling hoses on the dock side as the flames spread. Captain Brannan of Stella Maris brought his tug back in to spray the burning ship and found the fire too big for a single hose. A whaler from HMS Highflyer and a steam pinnace from HMCS Niobe joined him. They were rigging a hawser to tow Mont Blanc away from the pier when the 20 minutes ran out. There was one man in Halifax that morning who knew what was on the ship and what to do with that knowledge. His name was Patrick Vincent Coleman. He was a dispatcher for the Intercolonial Railway, working in a railway office about 230 meters from Pier 6. A sailor running from the harbor told him and his colleague, William Lovett, what Mont Blanc was carrying. Lovett ran. Coleman started to run, then turned back. Coleman remembered the overnight passenger train from St. John. It was due in within minutes. There were roughly 300 people aboard. He returned to his telegraph key, alone, with the burning ship in plain view through his window, and began to send. The Maritime Museum of the Atlantic preserves one version of his message. Hold up the train. Ammunition ship afire in harbor, making for Pier 6, and will explode. Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys. The message went out along the intercolonial railway line. Other stations heard it. Coleman did not leave his post. Whether his telegram is what stopped the St. John train at Rockingham, a safe distance from the blast, is something the historical record cannot establish. The train was halted. The passengers survived. But Wikipedia's careful summary of the evidence is honest. The causal link between Coleman's message and the train stop is uncertain. What is certain is that his warning traveled the line, sped the dispatch of relief in the hours that followed, and that Coleman himself was killed at his post. At 9:04 and 35 seconds, the question of who had warned whom became a question for after. The blast wave left Mont Blanc at over 1,000 meters per second. At the center of the explosion, temperatures reached about 5,000 degrees Celsius, with pressures of thousands of atmospheres. The ship was simply gone. Fragments of her hull traveled for kilometers. A barrel of one of her guns landed several miles inland. A column of white smoke rose to about 3,600 meters above the harbor. The shock was felt in Cape Breton, 207 kilometers away, and on Prince Edward Island, 180 kilometers away. Where the harbor had been, the sea floor was briefly exposed. Then the water rushed back in and rose as a tsunami, 18 meters above the high water mark on the Halifax shore. Imo, the unladen ship that had refused to yield, was carried up onto the Dartmouth coast and dumped there. The whaler from Highflyer lost all but one of its men. The pinnace from Niobe lost everyone. Of the 26 men aboard Stella Maris, 21 died, including her captain, Horatio Brannan. On shore, the toll was a different order of magnitude. More than 1,600 people died in the first minute. Every building within a 2.6-kilometer radius was destroyed or badly damaged. Over 12,000 structures in all. An area of more than 400 acres was simply removed. The Acadia Sugar Refinery, a large brick and stone factory near Pier 6, became an unrecognizable heap of rubble. Most of its workers died inside it. 55 railway workers were killed in the Richmond yards. The Royal Naval College of Canada building was wrecked, with cadets and instructors maimed. Stoves and lamps overturned in shattered houses started a second wave of fires across the North End, and entire blocks burned with their residents trapped inside. Of the 8-man crew of the engine Patricia, only one survived. His name was Billy Wells. The blast tore the clothes from his body and threw him clear. Wells later described the streets in plain words. People hanging dead from broken windows, some without heads, some thrown up onto the overhead telegraph wires. The hospitals filled within an hour. The new Camp Hill Military Hospital admitted approximately 1,400 victims on December 6th alone. The Chebucto Road School was converted into a central morgue under a system originally devised by John Henry Barnstead to catalog the Titanic dead in 1912. His son, Arthur S. Barnstead, ran it that day. Among the wounds were the eyes. Thousands of people had watched the fire through windows. When the blast wave reached those windows, the glass came at them edge-on. According to an article in the British Journal of Ophthalmology, in the days that followed, ophthalmologists in Halifax performed 249 enucleations, surgical removals of the eye. 16 patients lost both eyes. Most were civilians who had simply been watching a ship burn. Halifax would, in the years afterward, become an internationally recognized center for the care of the blind, in part because of these patients. That fact is not consolation. It is a record. Across the harbor, the small Mi'kmaq community of Turtle Grove at Tough Cove sat almost directly opposite Pier 9 on the Halifax side, well within the obliteration radius. The settlement was destroyed by the blast and the tsunami together. In the months and years before the disaster, the Department of Indian Affairs had been actively pressuring the community to give up its land and move to a reserve. That removal had not yet taken place when Mont Blanc detonated. Census records for the community were incomplete. A precise Mi'kmaq death toll cannot be reconstructed. 9 bodies were recovered from Turtle Grove. There were 11 known survivors. The Halifax Remembrance Book lists 16 members of the Tufts Cove community as dead, though not all the dead at Tufts Cove were indigenous. The settlement was never rebuilt. Survivors were housed in a racially segregated building under generally poor conditions, and most were eventually dispersed across Nova Scotia. The land was not returned. This is part of the explosion, not adjacent to it. The black community of Africville sat on the southern shore of Bedford Basin, partially shielded from the direct blast by raised ground. Africville's small wooden homes were nonetheless heavily damaged. 5 of its residents were killed. Africville had, before the disaster, been systematically underserved. No fire protection, no police, no water mains, no sewer lines, despite its residents paying city taxes. After the disaster, that pattern continued. Africville received almost none of the donated relief funds. When the Halifax Relief Commission and the planner Thomas Adams designed the celebrated hydrostone reconstruction in the North End, 326 large homes on tree-lined boulevards built a fireproof compress-cement block, Africville was not included. The community would not be demolished by the city until the 1960s. None of this is a footnote to the explosion. It is a description of who the relief was for. By the next morning, Halifax was buried in something else. A blizzard dropped 16 inches of heavy snow on the city on December 7th, halting search operations and stalling relief trains and drifts across the Maritimes. Within an hour of the blast, the question in Halifax was no longer what had happened. It was who would answer for it. The Rec Commissioner's inquiry opened at the Halifax Courthouse on December 13, 1917, exactly 1 week after the blast. Justice Arthur Drysdale presided. The inquiry's job was to assign cause and responsibility for the collision. Its report was filed on February 4, 1918, and its conclusions were not what most of Halifax had expected. The Crown Counsel, W.A. Henry, would later call the verdict a great surprise. Most people had assumed Imo would be blamed for being on the wrong side of the channel. Drysdale blâme de Mont Blanc. Specifically, he blamed 3 men. Captain M. Lemedec for failing to ensure that a ship carrying that cargo avoided collision at all costs. Pilot Francis Mackey, the same Mackey who had requested a guard ship the night before and been refused. And Commander F. Evan Wyatt, the Royal Canadian Navy's chief examining officer in charge of the Harbour, the gates, and the anti-submarine defenses. Drysdale appears to have been guided by 2 things. The opinion of Dominion Rec Commissioner L. Adamers, who held that the responsibility for avoiding a collision lay entirely with the explosive ship, and the strongly anti-French temper of public opinion in Halifax in the weeks after the disaster. The street fighter style of Imo's lawyer, Charles Burchell, did not hurt the Norwegian ship's case either. All 3 men were charged with manslaughter and criminal negligence at a preliminary hearing before stipendiary magistrate Richard M. MacLeod and bound over for trial. It did not last. Nova Scotia Supreme Court Justice Benjamin Russell found there was no evidence to support the charges against Mackey. Mackey was discharged on a writ of habeas corpus, and the charges were dropped. Because Lemedec had been arrested on the same warrant, the charges against him were dismissed too. Only Wyatt was indicted on a separate warrant, the only one of the 3 men actually tried. On April 17, 1918, a jury acquitted him in a trial that lasted less than a day. No one was convicted of any crime. The civil litigation continued in parallel. On April 27, 1918, Drysdale heard the first civil suit between the 2 ship's owners. He found Mont Blanc entirely at fault. That was appealed. On May 19, 1919, the Supreme Court of Canada reversed the apportionment to equal blame between Mont Blanc and Imo. That too was appealed. On March 22, 1920, the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in London upheld the Supreme Court's finding. 2 ships, equal blame. The men who had been charged, the captain who could not run his explosive cargo aground, the pilot who had asked for a guard ship and been refused, the naval commander who oversaw a harbor where pre-war regulations had been quietly suspended for the war, walked out of the system. There's a pattern in that. The institutional decisions that put Mont Blanc in the inner harbor at all, the wartime relaxation, the absence of guard ships for explosive cargo, the routing of ammunition through a city of 65,000 people, were never on trial. They cannot be. The Wreck Commissioner's inquiry was a navigational inquiry. Its question was, which ship gave the wrong whistle? Its question was not, who decided that ammunition ships could queue with passenger ferries? Meanwhile, the Halifax Relief Commission, formed at noon on December 6th under Lieutenant Governor McCallum Grant, kept working. It would continue, in one form or another, until 1976, distributing pensions to survivors. It rebuilt the heart of Richmond as the Hydrostone neighborhood, 326 fireproof concrete block homes on tree-lined boulevards. It did not rebuild Turtle Grove, and it did not rebuild Africville. No one was ever convicted. The harbor rules that had been suspended for the war were quietly written back, and the city began the long task of remembering what it had not been allowed to prevent. Return for a moment to the citizens at the windows. They are there because a ship was burning, and a burning ship is a thing worth watching, and nobody has told them that this particular fire is a fuse. They are office clerks, their children kept home from school, there are women holding babies, there are dock workers waiting for a shift. They have, between the collision and the detonation, less than 20 minutes. They do not know it. The crew of Mont Blanc are rowing for Dartmouth, shouting warnings in French and broken English, and the warnings are not reaching them. Patra Vincent Coleman is at his telegraph key, 230 meters away, sending a message that names the ship, names the pier, and names what is about to happen, and they will not hear that message either. Some of them will be dead in less than a minute. About 1,600 will die instantly. Of the survivors at the windows, hundreds will be blinded by glass. 249 of them will undergo enucleation, 16 of them in both eyes. The Mi'kmaq settlement at Turtle Grove, watching the same fire from across the water, will be obliterated and never rebuilt. The black community of Africville will be left out of the relief. And the men who put a ship full of TNT and picric acid alongside Pier 6 will, within 3 years, have walked out of every courtroom that tried to name them. What survives is a record. The Halifax Explosion Remembrance Book lists 1,782 names. Coleman's telegram survives in the archives of the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic. Mackey's testimony at the Wreck Commissioner's inquiry survives. Hydrostone neighborhood still stands. The Halifax Explosion Memorial Bells, installed in 1985 on Fort Needham Hill, ring every December 6th, facing the place the city used to call Richmond. What does not survive, what no inquiry, no appeal, no remembrance book has ever been able to reconstruct, is the quiet decision underneath all the others. Not Mackey's order to put the helm hard a port. That one is on the record. The earlier decision, the administrative one. The moment, somewhere in 1915 or 1916, when a wartime authority looked at the pre-war ban on dangerous cargo in the inner harbor and decided that the convoy schedule mattered more than the rule. We do not know who made that call, or in what room, or whether anybody at the time understood what it would cost. That is the hardest thing about institutional failure. It does not leave a captain at a wheel. It leaves a sentence struck out of a regulation book, and a city standing at its windows, not knowing what it is watching.